All right. Hello, everyone. Hope we're all doing well. So today we're going to be talking about Pigs, Puppies, and People by Alistair Norcross. This is a super fun paper. A lot of jokes in this paper, a lot of stuff it's just an entertaining paper. So I really enjoy assigning it because it's pretty accessible. So Norcross starts the paper off with a case. So imagine that we have somebody by the name of Fred, and Fred has a severe car accident in which he loses his ability to taste chocolate. Let's just suppose that the reason why we can taste chocolate is because a hormone is released in our brain called cocamone. Okay, and so in the car wreck, he realizes that his brain has stopped producing cocamone naturally, right? And so he finds out due to some kind of small scale research that puppies produce cocamone when they undergo long-term periods of stress, right? So we have puppies producing cocamone in their brains when they're stressed for a long duration of time. And so what he does is he sets up a puppy torture chamber in his basement, which oddly enough looks like the cages where they keep the broiler hens, right? And the laying hens. Just kind of tight little cages where, you know, once they're kind of 6 months old, the cage is like too small for them, right? They don't have very much room to turn around or to move. So he sets up a puppy torture chamber and he just induces stress onto these puppies so that over a period of time, say 6 months or so, their brains are producing cocamone. And so he harvests the puppy brains by killing them and taking their brains and extracts the cocamone from their brains. And so when he gets arrested and he's in court, he justifies his behavior by saying that human pleasure is on the line, right? That is, he needs the cocamone in order to taste chocolate, right? And so he gets a lot of pleasure from tasting chocolate. And so he says that, look, this is a good reason for me to continue this practice in my basement, right? And so how do we assess this case, right? This case seems really bad because most of us like don't want to see puppies get, I don't know, obliterated by a guy who likes chocolate, right? So it seems like what Fred is doing, Fred's behavior is morally suspect, right? It's probably morally wrong, but it's at least morally suspect, right? And it doesn't seem like pleasure is a good justification for treating puppies as such. Okay, so let's think about both Fred's story and our own story. So Norcross wants to say is that, look, what's happening in Fred's basement is actually really similar to a practice that we all participate in all the time, which is the factory farming meat industry. So we often eat meat because we like it, just like Fred, right? So the reason, our reason for, pardon me, a reason for eating meat is for gustatory pleasure, right? We like the taste. And so animals are raised in factory farms or enhanced farming facilities, right? Where they're sort of maximizing output. But they're raised in these environments and they're treated comparably to Fred's puppies. For instance, broiler chickens, pigs, probably cows as well, right? And so given that pigs and puppies have roughly the same level of intelligence, it follows that there doesn't seem to be a clear moral difference between a pig and a puppy on the one hand and on the other hand, right? And so if we think this is his what he wants to get is this conditional statement. If we think that Fred's behavior is morally wrong, then we must also believe and think that the factory farming is morally wrong, right? So if you buy it in the one case, if you say, man, that's wrong, Fred should be arrested, then you also have to think that in the other case as well. So long as these two cases are similar in all of the relevant ways, then you have to, if you're going to make one claim, you got to make the other claim. Or you could go the other way where you have to say, okay, look, I hope that factory farming is okay because I really like the taste. And so I got to bite the bullet and I got to say what Fred is doing is morally okay too, even though I don't like to say that. So you have to go with one of these options according to Norcross. Okay, so and then he talks about potential differences between Fred's basement and the factory farm. I'm going to go through these kind of fast. So first of all, one objection is that Fred actually does the slaughtering himself, and that's what makes the difference. So, for instance, if I eat meat, it's not likely that I've killed the meat myself. I've bought it from a grocery store, and somebody else killed it, and somebody else raised it. So somebody else has made the animal suffer. Okay, so we might think, what if Fred is like an old man, right? And he like this is in response. What if Fred is like an old man and like can't doesn't want to do this, or maybe doesn't have the time, so he hires someone, and so he has like an employee that does all this for him. Is he like somehow off the hook in this case, right? And then that guy's on the hook. It still seems morally suspect. It's the idea there. So that's the intuition he's trying to pump. Maybe that does change something, right? Maybe Norcross isn't quite right here, but it does strongly seem as so, at least to me, that there's still something problematic, even if he's not doing it himself, right? And so one thing in the Buddhist tradition, they're largely a vegetarian religion because, people are animals, right? And we're all caught up in cyclic existence as well. So it's wrong to kill and eat animals. But according to that tradition, it's worse to actually kill the animal. And so if you're eating an animal that wasn't killed by you, that's somehow not quite as bad as eating an animal that was killed by you, right? So, so this objection does find support at least in the Buddhist tradition, right? But I do think that it's still morally suspect in relevant ways. Okay, so that's not, so even though that may seem like a difference between the Fred case and our own case, it doesn't amount to a significant difference. That's what he's trying to show here. Okay, the next objection is that consumers are unaware of the practices that are happening in factory farms. He wants to say is like, look, if you're reading this article, you're no longer unaware of the practices that happen in factory farms, right? And so, and he also points out that consumers are becoming more aware. And so even if this is a good justification, it's not going to be a good justification for long. We might also think about the size of the industries. Maybe that makes some difference. So like Fred's basement is like small, and then like factory farming is like gigantic, right? So in response to this, he comes up with a modified case, chocolate mousse, Alabama, which is really funny. So suppose that Auburn University has discovered the Kokomo process, right? And has marketed it like to everyone, right? And so they're like big puppy farms everywhere, right? Not everywhere, but in a lot of places. And let's suppose it becomes Alabama's #1 export. And let's suppose that I'm sitting in a restaurant and I'm like, oh yeah, what's in this coffee, right? They're like, oh yeah, it's Kokomo and it's taken from puppy brains. You're like, what? Wait, what about puppy brains, right? It still seems like there's a problem with my partaking in it, even though I won't make any difference if I don't do it, right? So, and then he also wants to push back on this idea that we don't make any difference when we refrain from eating meat. It's a little bit more sophisticated response, but the idea here is that intuitively, it seems wrong to do it, to eat Kokomo, even in the large scale case as well, right? And then he makes this other distinction between intended as a means versus merely foreseen side effect. So this is a really interesting objection. So in the Fred case, he's making the animals suffer in order for them to produce Kokomo, right? And so he's intending their suffering as a means, right? Okay, and when we're but in the factory farm case, animals suffer, but we're not intending to make them suffer, right? They're just suffering as a side effect of this practice, right? So in the one case, you have Fred who's trying to make these puppies feel pain, and in the other case, you have people who are raising animals who aren't necessarily trying to make them suffer, right? They're just trying to raise them up and then kill them, uh, which sounds like suffering. But let's just suppose that they're not intentionally making them suffer. So this seems to be two relatively different, practices or intentions, right? So, and this is called the doctrine of double effect. So the doctrine of double effect says that if you intentionally harm someone as a means, that's morally wrong. But if suffering and harm is merely a side effect of some other intention or means, well, then that's like somehow less wrong. Um, so let's imagine a modified case where where it's not the stress that produces the cocamone. Let's imagine that what produces cocamone is when we shove drain cleaner down puppies' mouths, right? Um, so we're not intending to harm the puppies, right? We're just putting Drano down their mouths. That seems to be like really bad, right? But it isn't an intend. So we're not intending their suffering as a means. Rather, their suffering from having Drano put down their mouth, their mouth is merely a foreseen side effect of us putting Drano down their mouth. That seems ludicrous, right? It seems unjustifiable to say that, look, it's okay that we put Drano down a puppy's mouth because it's merely a foreseen side effect, right? That seems just bonkers. So it seems like when we modify the case in this kind of way, we can actually reconnect the factory farming case and Fred's basement case. Okay, so this is when Norcross offers up his argument. So the Fred case shows us that if it is wrong to torture puppies for gustatory pleasure, then it is also wrong to support factory farming. Okay, so that's the kind of connection that he's trying to establish, right? And if he's successful, then premise one is true. Okay, and then he gives us a modus ponens. So he's going to affirm the antecedent and he's going to get the consequent. Okay, number two is it is in fact wrong to torture puppies for gustatory pleasure. And so it follows that it's wrong to support factory farming. And that's what we've been trying to show by looking at all of these supposed differences between the two cases. We're trying to establish the connection between Fred's basement and the factory farming case. Okay, but the Texans' challenge accepts premise one as true, but it turns the argument into a modus tollens argument. So we're going to deny the consequent, and then we're going to deny the antecedent as a conclusion. So if it's wrong to torture puppies for gustatory pleasure, then it is also wrong to support factory farming, right? So the Texan is going to say, okay, that's fine. But the Texan is going to deny premise two. They're going to say it is not wrong to torture puppies for gustatory pleasure, right? So they are denying the antecedent, and then they get to also deny the consequent as well. So we may think about like responses here. One response we might get from the Singer lecture from before, where we might say like, look, all animals deserve equal consideration. And so like, well, it is wrong to say intentionally cause a puppy to suffer, right? That would be speciesist. And so that's one way to skip premise two. Okay, and then lastly, he talks a lot about the challenge of marginal cases. So when we set a line or draw a line between who matters, morally speaking, with some either rational, by rational, I mean like we are rational beings, right? Or some sort of intelligence-based characteristic, we will exclude many humans from the moral community. So for instance, infants, the severely mentally disabled, right? Those folks lack those characteristics. And so it seems like they fall out of our membership in our moral communities, which is like really bad, right? So we're in a dilemma. So we have two options. We could either broaden the scope of who matters morally, right? Maybe sentient beings, beings that can suffer, right? Maybe beings that are alive, right? Like Good Pastor had mentioned in his essay. But the thing is that if we broaden that sphere, we will also include many, many non-humans in our moral community, right? And so we have to accept that as a consequent, right? Because whatever feature we identify to include infants, the severely mentally disabled, is also going to include some other non-human mammals, like probably whales and apes. And then number two, the other prong of the dilemma is that we can keep the scope of who matters morally narrow, right, with some sort of intelligence-based characteristic. But the thing is, we'll leave out many humans, right? So we either have to keep it narrow and leave people out, or we broaden it and we put a bunch of people in that we wouldn't think, put a bunch of like animals in. So Norcross's solution is that we broaden the scope to include animals as well. But he gives us two potential responses for someone who wants to maintain that just humans matter morally. So one line of defense is to say that all humans have some feature that animals lack, right? Or that non-human animals don't have, something like human DNA, right? And this is like a really bad response, right? Because if we identify human DNA with what matters morally, this not only seems arbitrary, but also a bunch of stuff like that's like really weird gets to be part of the community as well, like a tumor, or like, I don't know, like a severed hand, right? An independent severed hand would just be like, oh, it's got human DNA, so it matters morally. That seems like really odd, right? And then the second line of response is to claim that, look, marginal humans really don't matter, morally speaking, right? But it makes sense to treat them like as if they mattered. And that seems to be just really implausible, especially for somebody who thinks that, you know, all humans matter to some degree, and to some degree equally as well, right? But some people have made this claim. So those are two potential responses. And Norcross, we won't get into the details, but Norcross wants to push back against both of these claims. And then lastly, he gives us the puppy version of the challenge of marginal cases. So for instance, we can say that puppies matter morally, right? And if we do that, then whatever feature we identify in a puppy is going to include many farm animals, right? Or we can say that puppies don't matter morally and no other farm animals matter morally. But that means that we have to accept Fred's behavior as being morally permissible if we go with the latter option, right? And so Norcross wants to go with the first option, right? So that we include both puppies and many farm animals in our sphere of moral concern. So thank you all. We've talked about Alistair Norcross's Pigs, Puppies, and People, and we talked about the problem of marginal cases, and as well as what the Fred's basement case gets us and the implications that has for factory farming practices. Thanks.